For 15 years, Pawn Stars made America feel like it knew the Harrison family. Rick, the shrewd dealmaker with a story for every item that crossed his counter. Corey, his son and on-air partner, the guy fans called Big Hoss. Chum Lee, the breakout star nobody saw coming. Millions of viewers watched this cast haggle over gold coins and vintage guitars every week for over a decade. But in January 2024, headlines started circulating about a Harrison nobody had ever heard of. Not Corey. Not Jake. A third son named Adam, a man who had never once appeared on the show that made his family famous. Within days, corners of the internet were speculating about what might be locked away in his private space. Hidden valuables, secret debts, some untold second life. None of it turned out to be true. What actually happened was far simpler and far sadder. The story of a man who spent nearly 2 decades fighting addiction, largely out of the public eye, until a drug now responsible for tens of thousands of American deaths a year finally caught up with him. This is that story, not the rumor, the record. Ask any longtime Pawn Stars fan to name the cast, and the list comes fast. Rick, Corey, Chum Lee, and the late old man Richard Harrison, who appeared in the show's early years until his death in 2018. The show first aired on the History Channel in 2009 and became one of the network's biggest hits, spinning off toys, games, and a small merchandising empire built around the gold and silver pawn shop on the Las Vegas Strip. What most viewers never knew is that Rick Harrison had 3 sons, not one. Corey, Rick's son with his first wife, Kim, became the face fans recognized. A younger son, Jake, came later, from Rick's second marriage. And in between them was Adam, also a son of Rick and Kim, who by multiple accounts worked around the family pawn business but was never part of the televised version of it. Adam wasn't hiding from a scandal, and there's no indication the family kept him off camera to conceal anything about him. He simply wasn't part of the show's cast. While Corey stepped into the role of on-screen negotiator and eventual co-owner, Adam's life ran on a separate private track, one that never intersected with a camera crew. That's worth sitting with for a second. This is a family whose entire public identity was built on being watched, on turning ordinary transactions into television. And yet one of Rick's own sons spent his adult life almost entirely outside of that. Fans could tell you Corey's favorite category of item to buy. Almost none of them could have told you Adam existed. To understand what happened to Adam, you have to go back roughly 2 decades, long before any headline used his name. In interviews after Adam's death, Rick Harrison said his son's problems with drugs began in his 20s. It wasn't a single incident. It was a cycle familiar to countless families across the country. Rehab, a period of doing well, then a relapse, then rehab again. Speaking later to broadcaster Graham Bensinger, Rick described putting Adam into treatment so many times, watching him improve, and then watching him fall back into old patterns, a pattern he said mirrors what a million other families have lived through. That's not a dramatic detail built for a headline. It's one of the most common and most painful realities in American families today, and it rarely gets discussed publicly unless a recognizable name is attached to it. Addiction doesn't check a person's bank balance before it takes hold, and it doesn't loosen its grip because a family happens to be well known. For years, Adam's struggle stayed almost entirely private, playing out far from the cameras that were pointed at the rest of his family. According to Rick, what eventually changed the equation wasn't years of gradual decline, it was fentanyl entering the picture. He has said publicly that his son's later drug use wasn't heroin, and that fentanyl was ultimately what ended his life. That distinction matters enormously, and it's worth explaining why. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration classifies as a Schedule II controlled substance, and the agency has noted that it can be roughly 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. The DEA has also said that as little as 2 milligrams, less than the weight of a few grains of salt, depending on body size, can be a lethal dose. That's part of why fentanyl has become so dangerous nationally. It's frequently mixed into other drugs, sometimes without the user's knowledge, which means someone who has survived years of substance use can be killed by a single dose they didn't know they were taking. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has tracked this shift for years. Overdose deaths involving synthetic opioids, fentanyl chief among them, rose sharply through the early 2020s before beginning to decline in 2024 after years of increases. Adam Harrison's death fits inside that larger, grim national pattern. He wasn't an outlier. He was one name inside a number that, most of the time, never makes the news at all. By late 2023, Adam's life had grown harder to track from the outside. According to an incident report later obtained by the New York Post, Adam had spent months in jail before moving into a guest house on a property in the Las Vegas area, where he lived for roughly 2 weeks before his death. A woman who was living nearby on the same property later told police that Adam's behavior in his final weeks had become alarming. Per that same incident report, she said he had barricaded himself inside at one point by pushing furniture against the door, and that his conversations sometimes lacked clear reasoning. Looking back, these are the kinds of details that read like warning signs. In the moment, they likely looked like something else entirely, a man in distress, not necessarily a man in his final days. Adam was last seen on January 17, 2024. When he didn't respond and neighbors grew concerned, the property's landlord went to check on him. On January 19, he was found dead inside the guest house. News broke within days. A representative for the Harrison family confirmed to media outlets that Adam had died, and the family asked for privacy, saying in a brief statement that they were extremely saddened by his loss. At that point, no cause of death had been made public, and for a short window, that absence of detail was exactly the kind of vacuum rumors tend to fill. When a private family doesn't immediately share every fact, especially a family that had spent years keeping one of its own out of the spotlight, speculation moves in fast. And in Adam's case, some of what circulated online reached for far more sensational explanations than what had actually happened. There was no hidden vault, no secret stash of valuables, no scandal waiting behind a locked door. The truth, when it came, was both simpler and heavier than any rumor. Just days after Adam's death, Rick Harrison confirmed directly to Fox News Digital that fentanyl was responsible, saying the crisis around the drug must be taken more seriously, and adding that it was flowing over the borders, with little being done to stop it. About 5 weeks later, on February 28, 2024, the Clark County, Nevada, office of the coroner/medical examiner made it official. Adam Harrison's cause of death was fentanyl and methamphetamine toxicity. His manner of death was ruled an accident, not a homicide, not a suicide. In a later interview, Rick put it in blunter, more personal terms, telling Bensinger that fentanyl had turned his son into someone he wasn't, and that it brought a string of bad decisions with it, including the jail time that preceded his final weeks in the guest house. That's the entire mystery. Not a garage full of secrets. A coroner's report confirming what an enormous number of American families already know firsthand, that fentanyl doesn't discriminate, and that survival through years of addiction is no guarantee against a single fatal dose. What followed Adam's death was, in some ways, more revealing than the death itself. Rick posted a photo of himself with Adam on Instagram, writing that his son would always be in his heart. Corey shared an old childhood photo of the two of them from decades earlier, captioned with a simple, blunt expression of love. Condolences poured in from friends and public figures, including a brief comment from Donald Trump Jr. Many commenters admitted, openly, that they hadn't known Rick had another son at all. A strange kind of grief to witness from a distance, people mourning someone whose existence they'd only just learned of. In the months that followed, Rick didn't retreat from the subject. In interviews with Fox News Digital and others, he spoke about the human toll of fentanyl trafficking, arguing that stronger enforcement at the border and harsher penalties for dealers were overdue. He later told Fox News Digital that he wanted anyone caught selling fentanyl to face life in prison, framing it as a poison rather than a recreational drug. Whatever a person makes of the policy debate underneath that, and there is a genuine, ongoing debate among public health experts and policymakers about the right mix of enforcement, treatment, and harm reduction, Rick's grief was plainly real, and he chose to make it public rather than private. Almost a year later, in an interview with Graham Bensinger, Rick spoke more reflectively about what it's like to lose a child. He described the second-guessing that never fully goes away, wondering whether he could have done something differently, even while believing, in his more clear-headed moments, that he'd done what he could. He said there's nothing worse than losing a child, and that there's no manual for parenting that accounts for every version of a kid you might end up with. Pawn Stars, meanwhile, entered a quieter chapter of its own. In 2025, Rick indicated the show was no longer under contract with History and had gone on an indefinite hiatus, a fact that, whether coincidental or not, arrived in the same general stretch of time as his family's private grief becoming public. The show that had turned this family into recognizable faces at grocery stores and airports across the country stepped back, at least for a while, leaving Rick and Corey to carry on without the format that had defined them for a decade and a half. It's tempting to file this away as a celebrity tragedy and move on. But the more useful way to look at it is almost the opposite. Adam Harrison's story is only newsworthy because of his last name. The substance of it, a young man's addiction beginning in his 20s, a long cycle of treatment and relapse, and a final fatal exposure to fentanyl, is not rare. It is, according to public health data, disturbingly common. The CDC has reported that deaths involving synthetic opioids climbed sharply for years before finally beginning to ease in 2024, after a long period of steady increases. Even with that recent decline, fentanyl remains one of the leading drivers of overdose deaths in the United States, cutting across every income bracket, every state, and, as this story shows, families that most people would assume are shielded from that kind of loss by fame or money. They aren't. Nothing is. That's really the harder truth underneath the headline. People went looking for a locked door mystery because a mystery is easier to sit with than the alternative, that a man can struggle for the better part of 2 decades, that a family with real resources and real love for him can still lose him, and that the actual explanation is a public health crisis playing out in ghost houses and apartments across the country every single day, most of which never make the news at all. So no, there was never a hidden vault, a secret life, or a scandal waiting behind a locked door. What was actually there was a father's grief, a family's long and mostly private struggle, and a warning that Rick Harrison has chosen again and again to say out loud in public rather than keep to himself. Adam Harrison's story became public because of his father's fame. But the pain underneath it wasn't a celebrity story at all, it was an ordinary one, playing out in an extraordinary number of households across the country.